Hello everyone, James Hancock here. I am back to discuss the ongoing adventures of James Keziah Delaney, aka Tom Hardy's character from the excellent show Taboo. Episode 5, I think it was a very solid episode. It's not my favorite episode of the season thus far, but I feel like I did an excellent job of kind of showing where the second half of this first season is going to go. To my knowledge, this season ends at episode 8. Hopefully, fingers crossed, they're doing a season 2. I need to do some research on that front to determine if that is the case. At any rate, it's a very solid show, sometimes even a great show, and it seems to have widespread appeal for anyone who's willing to give it a try. I even showed it to my mother a couple days ago, and she rapidly started binge watching the previous episodes because she will watch anything that has English accents, and Taboo certainly has that. So let's get into some of the details of episode 5. So episode 5 begins with this extraordinary sequence where everybody is riding through the fog and the mist of the morning up this river for the big duel to the death between James Delaney and his loathsome brother-in-law, Thorne Geary. I mean, this is a show with a lot of moral gray area, but I think we can all agree that Thorne Geary has got to go. He is a total piece of shit, and I can't stand him. We get some interesting details about the rules and regulations of dueling according to the Irish Code of 1777. While Thorne might want it to be an automatic duel to the death, apparently there are certain rules where if somebody gets injured, they're automatically allowed to have a doctor to tend to them, and that if anybody fires a second shot while the person's being tended to, then they can in turn be fired upon by other people nearby. They have rules and codes of conduct and that sort of thing, and they drop a nice white handkerchief. And I love how the person who's the referee says that after he drops the handkerchief, that the two gentlemen will proceed toward one another for a polite exchange of bullets. It's England after all. I mean, we're not completely without manners. But when Thorne fires, he hits James right on the heart, but nothing happens. Just a little bit of gunpowder. And James just kind of brushes it off, walks right up to him, apologizes, and then turns his gun on Thorne's second and says he's clearly a company man because he loaded your gun without a ball, and boom, blows out the back of his brain. And Thorne is obviously very shaken by this because he realizes that the East India Company values James's life over his. So the main thrust of this episode is the fallout over all the saltpeter being stolen from the East India Company. James's chemist, Mr. Chumley, is hard at work brewing all these foul concoctions that he needs in order to make the gunpowder that James will need for his big voyage to the New World. East India Company is turning London upside down looking for it because apparently the Crown had already bought the saltpeter for the British Navy, and essentially the East India Company is at the very least guilty of negligence, possibly guilty of being complicit in the crime, or at least that's what the Crown is saying. So the East India Company is totally freaking out. James is very discreetly trying to take care of business while his house is being ransacked and people are following him. He even has this great scene where a person following him out to his factory, James catches him and almost pulls out some like early 1800s jiu-jitsu. He has this great back control and a knife, and he cuts the guy up a bit, gives him a little warning about following him, and then he's really hell-bent upon always kind of slashing the backs of people's legs. I couldn't tell if he was essentially gelding him and chopping his balls off, or if he was just giving him a few more slashes to teach him a lesson, but it's all off screen, so we don't really know what he did. Anyway, James is not to be trifled with. We get some great comedy with Tom Hollander, who's maybe my favorite character in the show, aka Mr. Chumley, the chemist. And he's asking James about Lorna Bowe, and he's saying, she is one of the women, part of the large number of women that I would sleep with, and a part of the even smaller number of women that I would masturbate over. And James doesn't seem too keen on exposing Lorna to the tender embraces of the mad chemist. But what he does do is he finds his son who is unaware that he is James's son, and signs him up as an apprentice to work under Mr. Chumley, which is pretty cool because at least he's going to learn a trade, maybe a very volatile, very dangerous one. But I like how James is not totally ignoring the child. The child is very scared of James, but it'll be interesting to see how James approaches being a father compared to his own father, who was obviously in a lot of ways quite the madman. Tom Hollander, who's never one to let a scene go by without an opportunity to deliver some great comic relief. He's showing the boy how to taste these foul chemicals. He kind of makes him taste it, and the child does so. And then Tom looks at him and just goes, and the child has to do it in return. But it's just a simple little gesture. But for whatever reason, I just howled with laughter when I saw it. We get another great scene of James taking care of business when he goes to all of his goons who handled the the theft of the saltpeter from the East India Company, and he says that he's aware of the fact that East India Company is offering £10 for anyone with information about the theft. He thinks that also one person in his group has already been approached and is considering the offer. He says anyone who is doing business with them will have no place with me when I sail for the New World. He says, for he will have no thumb, and wapow! It just chops the thumb right off the guy. The guy howls and screams, and then he takes the thumb over to the brothel, who a lot of the girls working there also participated, and he basically puts out a diamond and the thumb on a table and lets them know that they have a choice between wealth and or missing digits when it comes to working with him. There's a really, really cool scene where Lorna comes downstairs and sees James going through his father's trunk. She finally brought it to him, and he's burning all the letters that his father wrote to him, and he's crying, but he obviously is not even reading a lot of them, and Lorna's kind of horrified by the fact that he'd be so blasé and casual about something that was so personal to his father. But James admits that basically his father bought James's mother for beads, while at the same time he bought Nootka Sound for gunpowder. But that when they arrived back in Europe, when the mother was unable to pretend to be either unwilling or unable to pretend to be either Spanish or Italian, that essentially the father had her sent off to an insane asylum. So James obviously has some deep, deep resentment toward his father for the treatment of his mother. But what he does do is, or what he manages finally to do, is to find the original treaty between his father and the chief of the tribe. So now he has proof that it was a transaction, not conquest, because as they pointed out in a previous episode, if it was a matter of conquest, the crown could possibly make a claim on the land, but if it's a business transaction, it's totally legitimate. So at least James is in the clear on that front. The Prince Regent is none too pleased with the missing saltpeter, and he's decided he's going to kind of put the screws to Sir Stuart Strange, and couldn't happen to a nicer fellow. And his advisor, Solomon Coupe, comes up with a scheme by which they can really make Sir Stuart Strange squirm. As we've seen many flashbacks and allusions to, there was clearly a slave ship that the East India Company was involved with, in spite of the fact that, at least on the surface, by the letter of the law, they were prohibited from doing so. So they invite a black man by the name of George Chichester, who is a kind of a human rights advocate, and he's been basically for the last 9 years trying to shine a light on the fact that nearly 300 people were essentially murdered when they were drowned in this boat in an effort to disguise what had happened, and also that a lot of the men at the East India Company were involved. And to his shock and delight, he is appointed as essentially an investigator by the Prince Regent to open up a case. And Sir Stuart Strange completely freaks out and starts thinking about what documents need to be burned in order to cover his very, very slimy trail. The last big twist of the episode, James is summoned to a hospital that is apparently infected with cholera to see Dumbarton. He claims he's immune. He walks in there, but apparently the cholera is just a ruse or a smokescreen to keep people from investigating, because it's where Dumbarton, the American agent, works. And he says that he wants James's gunpowder. James says, hell no. But Dumbarton's perfectly willing to tell the East India Company about his little factory if he doesn't comply. He also needs the gunpowder in 8 days because the American Navy is going to run out in 10, where they're fighting over in this blockade near Ireland. James tells him that's impossible. However, Dumbarton reminds him about a French experiment, or tells him to ask Mr. Cholmondeley about the French experiment. Mr. Cholmondeley tells him that it's an experiment where you add chlorite to the mix. It does speed things up. You have to constantly stir. And if you stop at any point, it becomes volatile and explodes and kills everybody. And he's not a madman and doesn't want to do that. James essentially tells him, if we don't do this, we're all going to hang in 8 days' time. So he says he's going to find him the men, and that Mr. Cholmondeley should find the chlorite, and that they're going to roll the dice. And then he goes to meet with the head of the American organization in London, Carlsbad, in her home. And it looks as if they're going to be able to make a deal, but she says that he's going to have to trust her to an extent, which obviously he is reluctant to do. What James would like is to have an escort with the gunpowder to the American forces near Ireland, deliver the gunpowder, and then sail on to the New World where he can start his business, so on and so forth. But it all involves a great deal of risk. Meanwhile, his poor sister, Zilpha, is sleeping, and she says James in a tone of ecstasy. Her husband Thorne gets freaked out, starts beating her, and then is convinced that an exorcism needs to be performed in order to prevent James from entering her body in the night, and that's so on and so forth. So this creepy priest shows up, and they tie her down against her will, and he's kind of groping her, molesting her, and it's basically like a borderline rape, if not outright. And he's saying all these words and pouring holy water on her. And he leaves. And that night, sees Zilpha is pissed. Her husband's asleep. And she's thinking to herself, but she says, teach me, guide me. And she pulls out, well, look, I couldn't tell if it was like a needle or a wand or some sort of, I don't know, component. But she looks at her husband who's asleep. And she's clearly about to do something very, I don't know, terrifying to him. Something that James would approve of. So I'm interested to see what's going to happen. Not the world's greatest cliffhanger, but an interesting one. So I'm very, very fired up for episode 6 next week. Hope you guys are enjoying the show. If you enjoyed this video, please give my channel a subscribe and check out the show notes below my podcast, Wrong Reel. And it's a podcast about film. And if you enjoy these videos, you'll probably enjoy Wrong Reel. It's more of this, but just longer and me talking to other people. Give me a shout on Twitter at Colbrex if you want to talk about flicks or TV or whatever. And I hope you guys have a very, very pleasant evening. So long.